and give the next talk, please.
Lisa, you're new to this meeting.
I am.
For those of you who haven't listened to Lisa's contribution to Bill's Journey to Better Broadcasting, listen to that episode. You moved me, and I think a lot of people in this room, and I cannot wait to hear from you.
Thank you. Well, thank you for being here, and thank you, Bill, for inviting me and allowing me to share my story. A few years ago, I found myself standing at a threshold. I was in my mid-50s, life on the outside looked full. But something deep within me had begun to stir. I was reaching the age my mother was when she was diagnosed with breast cancer and eventually lost that battle at 58. I was longing for something that felt real. It was a sense of urgency that I felt, a sense of urgency that caused this longing to not just live longer, but to live deeper. I wasn't in crisis, but again, I was craving something real. I was tired of the shallow waters I had been wading through. I was tired of conversations that skimmed the surface. I was tired of a world obsessed with performance and appearance. I longed for connection that felt real. I longed to be seen for who I really am and to see others that way too. That's when the idea of the Camino de Santiago came into my life. Those of you who do not know, the Camino is an ancient pilgrimage in Europe. The Francis route stretches 500 miles across northern Spain and ends at the Cathedral of Santiago, where the Apostle St. James is said to be buried. It has been walked for over 1,000 years for direction, for answers, for healing, for faith. There's a tradition on the Camino where people bring a rock from their home. And when they reach Cruz de Faro, the Iron Cross, they lay that rock down along with their burdens. I didn't know what I needed to lay down, what I needed to release, but I knew I had to go. Before I left, something pulled me towards the old oak tree in the front yard of the home that I grew up in. I dug in the soil, I found a small, smooth stone. I was sure that stone had been there since I was a little girl, since the days I climbed that very tree. That moment at the tree felt very sacred. It felt as though something was being stirred in the soil and in my soul. I held that rock and thought, this rock is part of me. And I carried that rock with me across Spain, mile after mile, over 300 miles, until I reached the Iron Cross. There it was, a tall wooden pole 20 feet high with a 5-foot iron cross at the top. At its base, thousands of rocks, perhaps millions left by pilgrims over the centuries. The air was still, silent, and reverent. I watched others approach as they silently placed their rock down. I reached into my pocket and I felt the rock that I had been carrying with me for weeks. It felt warm, familiar, a little heavier than I remembered, but I still didn't know what burden that it carried. I waited for the moment, the pull, the knowing, and then I made my way toward the cross. Halfway up the mound, my knees buckled, I knelt, the rock in my hand, and the words came. I lay before you, O Lord, this rock from my childhood. This rock carries the burden of limits the world placed on the girl that you created. She was pure and free and full of light until the world told her who she had to be. This rock carries the shame that others have placed on her. I lay it at your feet. I release the fear, doubt, and shame that kept her from living her fullest life. And as I spoke those words, a clear vision came into my mind. I saw a younger girl my younger self, standing alone surrounded by a high wall of stones. Each stone was heavy and rough and marked with the things that I had been carrying: fear, doubt, shame, silence, smallness. And one by one, those rocks began to fall, first slowly, then faster. It was as if each confession, each truth spoken at that cross loosened another rock from the wall. Stone by stone, the wall crumbled around her. And there she was, the girl I used to be, the one I left behind. She stood in the center of that rubble, eyes wide, soul bright. She had been waiting for me to return and set her free. And I did. I stood up. I felt so incredibly light. I grabbed my backpack and I got back on the trail. I started walking, then jogging, then running. I didn't mean to, I just couldn't stop. I ran faster and faster until I felt like I was flying. I reached back for my backpack because I thought that I had dropped it. I hadn't, it just didn't feel heavy anymore. Tears streamed from my face, not from pain, but from something holy, something whole. And then I rounded a bend, and there before me was a rainbow. A perfect arch rainbow stretched over that trail like a doorway. I grabbed my phone to take a picture because I could not believe what I was seeing. And then I ran straight through it like crossing a finish line I hadn't even known I was racing toward. And as I ran through that rainbow, I was taken back to a moment at the very beginning of the Camino. Day one, crossing the Pyrenees Mountains. The wind was strong that day. Clouds drifted low and white over the mountain ridges. And that's when I saw wild horses. They were running freely along the ridgeline, manes tossed by the wind, hooves striking the earth without restraint. They weren't caged in, they weren't controlled, they were simply free. And something in their movement awakened a longing in me, a primal ache I didn't understand. I had forgotten what it was like to move without fear, to run without apology. And in that moment, on the trail high in the clouds, I heard the words within my soul: you are now free, you left it at the cross, there is nothing holding you back, run, my wild horse, run and be free. Tears are now in full force down my face, not from sadness, but from release, because in that moment, I was not a woman on the Camino. I was that wild horse, running the mountaintops, untethered, unashamed, unstoppable. My soul was free. And just like that, the journey changed. It was no longer about the physical path I was walking. It was about the freedom that I found at the cross. The freedom to be exactly who He created me to be. Shame no longer had control over me. I left it at the cross. But to understand that freedom fully, I would like to read to you something that I wrote about when shame first entered my life. The very first time that I felt the sting of it. Assembly day came with a mix of excitement and nerves. I was in second grade, still small enough to be in awe of high schoolers who walked differently, talked differently, existed on an entirely different level. On assembly day, they came from their own building into ours to gather in the gym. And I always tried to look my best. Maybe one of them would think I was cool like them. That morning, I woke earlier than I needed to. I wanted to pick the perfect dress. The one that would make me look just a little bit older, a little more grown up, a little cooler. I tried on the first one, wrinkled. The second, too plain. and then I reached for my favorite. It was a soft light blue with fabric-colored buttons from the collarbone to the middle of the chest. The material felt smooth against my skin like wearing a cloud. I smiled as soon as I put it on. I knew it was the one. Still, I hesitated. Our school had strict rules about girls' clothing. All dresses had to fall below the kneecap. I didn't have a full-length mirror, so I bent over to see. It looked close, probably fine, but I needed to be sure. "Mom," I asked, "is my dress long enough?" She smiled at me in the mirror and said, "It looks beautiful, honey. The length is fine." She didn't really turn around. She didn't really check well. It was a quick glance, but I believed her. "Thanks, Mom," I said, hugging the soft fabric with both hands. I felt happy, proud. The dress felt like me, and that day I wanted to feel my best. I wanted to feel beautiful. Later that morning, I was seated in Mrs. Brigham's classroom watching her write our assignments on the chalkboard when the door creaked open at the back of the room. We all turned around. There she was, Mrs. Bond, the assistant principal, dressed in her yellow skirt suit, clipboard in hand. We all knew what her visit meant. Without needing to be told, every student stood up beside their desk. It was part of the ritual. Mrs. Bond made her way down the rows, checking that the boys' hair didn't touch their ears or collars. For the girls, she would kneel, press our dresses against our legs, and measure with her eyes. The closer she came to my row, the harder my heart pounded. I remember my mom's quick glance that morning and silently begged, "Please be right, Mom, please be right." Mrs. Bond reached me. "Straighten up, young lady," she said as I leaned forward in hopes of making the front of my dress the longest. I obeyed, lifted my chin, trying to look confident and not guilty. She bent down, pressed the dress flat against my thighs, and paused. "Aha," she said, with a note of satisfaction in her voice, and began scribbling furiously on her clipboard. My cheeks burned, my knees went weak. I could feel my classmates' eyes on me. I had been marked. "Wait at the back of the room," she said. I stood in silence, watching her continue her inspection. I was praying, "Please find someone else too. Don't let me be the only one." But no one else was called out. When she finished her rounds, she motioned for me to follow her. We walked to the principal's office. She sat behind the desk, opened up the top drawer, and pulled out a seam ripper. I watched her closely. I knew what it was. My mother had one. It had been used to fix mistakes. And then Mrs. Bond said the words that would stay with me for years as she began ripping the hem from my beautiful dress. "You are to let these strings hang from your dress as a reminder of your disobedience to the Lord." The words she spoke after were blurred together. I remember the phrase Jezebel spirit, sharp and strange, mixed in with scripture and scolding. I could no longer hear. I was frozen. I didn't cry. I didn't speak. I felt like I had been erased, replaced with someone who had done something bad, someone to be punished, someone to be watched. She walked me back to the classroom. Just as she opened the door, the bell rang for assembly. My classmates stood, gathered their things, and walked right past me in silence. No one said a word. I followed behind them, threads brushing my knees like quiet little whips. I felt exposed, marked. I didn't have the words for it then, but I carried a new weight that day, the sharp sting of shame. That blue dress, my favorite, my cloud, became something else. It became my first scarlet letter. In the scarlet letter, a novel I wouldn't read until much later, Hester Prynne is forced to wear a red A on her chest as punishment for her sin. It's meant to mark her with shame so that everyone will see her, judge her, and never forget what she did. That day in second grade, I wore my first version of it. Only mine wasn't red and embroidered. It was made of blue cotton, dangling thread, and a fear I didn't have the vocabulary for. But like Hester, I carried it publicly. And like her, I was told it meant something about who I was: disobedient, immodest, dangerous. I didn't fully understand those words, but I understood the feeling of being set apart, stared at, judged. What I see now, years later, is that my scarlet letter was never about a hemline. It was about control. It was about teaching young girls to doubt themselves, to distrust their instincts, to internalize the idea that being seen is the same thing as being wrong. And it's about shame, how it is sown into us before we even know what we've done to deserve it. That day, I wore no letter, but the frayed threads on my dress served the same purpose. It wasn't sewn on my dress, but it trailed behind me with every step in the form of unraveled fabric and the fear of being seen. I think of that little girl often, the one who picked out her favorite dress to feel beautiful, only to be punished for how it fit her growing body. I wish I could go back to her and kneel down and say, "You were not a Jezebel, you were not bad, you were not wrong, you were just a girl in a blue dress, and you are enough." And maybe you have your own version of that dress. Maybe your shame came from different words, different wounds, but it's just as real. Maybe it was a teacher, a parent, a coach, a church, a relationship. Maybe it was subtle, a comment, a glance, a silence. Maybe it was loud, a punishment, a rejection, a label you never asked for. What I learned on the Camino is that shame doesn't define us. It doesn't get to have the final word. You can lay it down, you can walk away, you can run. I ran like a wild horse on the mountaintops. I ran with nothing holding me back because I knew deep in my soul that I was no longer marked by shame. So if shame has whispered to you, if it's followed you, maybe it's time to set it down. Walk away from shame. Run like a wild horse and don't look back. And if you're longing for something more, if you're tired of shallow conversations, if you crave soulful connections, if you ache to be seen, truly seen for who you are, this is your invitation. To live deeper, to speak honestly, to strip off shame. You don't have to carry it anymore. Your story isn't over. The girl or boy within you is still there, and it's time to come home to them.